Pilot show Scotland at 7. Today we'll be covering the Scottish Government EU Continuity Bill, but first, the news. The Welsh EU Continuity Bill has been passed, with Conservatives being the only party to oppose it. The Scottish Bill is ongoing and the results are expected in the next hour. The Scottish Government has promised to match NHS England's pay rise in Scotland. The new pay deal in England will see NHS staff given pay rises of at least 6.5% over the next 3 years. Scotland's Health Secretary, Shona Robertson, said she hoped to reach a similar deal as soon as possible. Both the Scottish and UK governments recently lifted the 1% pay cap for public sector workers. The deal, agreed by the Department of Health and union leaders in England, will see the lowest paid jobs seeing the biggest rise, with some salaries increasing by 29%. Scotland's 3 leading female politicians have called to stamp out online abuse on Twitter. Nicola Sturgeon, Ruth Davidson and former Labour leader Kezia Dugdale have said they've received rape and death threats. Amnesty International has launched a campaign with the hashtag #ToxicTwitter. Campaigners say that Twitter has become a poisonous arena for women. The social media company says it's made significant changes to the platform over the last 16 months, but it cannot delete hatred and prejudice from society. MP Jo McAlpine says she's often abused online.
If we could turn to the stories in the media this morning about Twitter abuse, and in particular the gender aspect of it. Nicola Sturgeon, Kezia Dugdale and Ruth Davidson have all talked about the abuse that they've faced online in Twitter. Other female politicians have experienced the same. Is this something that has been part of your experience?
Yes, I've always been abused on Twitter and I've almost become immune to it. And what I do is I block people, any hint of abuse, and I block them. I think the internet is full of these people, and not just in politics, but like across public life, women are targeted. Some very nasty people out there, and I think it's probably best just to block them immediately. But I do think that the social media networks do have some kind of responsibility in terms of abuse, and I think we should step in and sort it out.
Do you think that women politicians, when they enter Parliament, are properly trained to deal with this?
I don't think there's any training that you can get to deal with that level of abuse. It's quite interesting, like in our day-to-day work, and this just isn't in politics, but there is a respect to gender. Now, like the whole Me Too movement, you've seen that you have increasingly high expectations of how you treat one another, whether your colleagues or the public. But those rules don't seem to apply online. It's sort of anything goes online, and so I think it can be very difficult for women who are just elected. They're elected because they want whatever their party is. They believe in something and they want to change it. And the last thing they expect is that level of personal abuse, which you never get in any other area of working life. And you and I both worked in newspapers, we're in a tough environment. I never came across anything of that nature working in newspapers. And yet you get entered into politics and you get this level of personal abuse, and I think some people find it very difficult.
Is it worse, do you think, for women?
I think it probably is.
An SNP MP has called the government's decision on the fisheries policy the worst deal imaginable. MP Drew Henry has demanded answers from the Prime Minister after she seemingly U-turned on the common fishery policy. UK Brexit Minister sparked anger on Monday when he announced plans to remain in the CFP beyond 2019. From then on, the UK will have no say on quotas. Last week, both the UK's Agriculture and Fisheries Secretary Michael Gove and Ruth Davidson said that Britain would certainly leave the CFP from March 2019. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, has been confronted over alleged Tory links to the data analyst Cambridge Analytica. The SNP, Ian Blackford, said CSC, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, had been founded by a former Tory MP, and that a director had donated over £70,000 to the party. Prime Minister said she was not aware of any current contracts with the companies, but her spokesman later confirmed the Conservatives had held initial discussions with Cambridge Analytica in the past, but no action was taken. Cambridge Analytica is facing claims over allegedly using personal data of 50 million Facebook users to influence the outcome of the US 2016 presidential election. Their influence over the UK Brexit referendum is also under scrutiny. MP Joe McAlpine says the problem is not a Scottish one.
If we could turn briefly to Cambridge Analytica and the Facebook controversy, is there a Scottish dimension to this, and is this something that Holyrood should be concerned about?
Well, I haven't had time to look at it in detail in terms of how it touches Scotland. If people are concerned about it and feel that there is evidence that Scotland has been directly affected, then they could come and ask the Parliament to look at it. I haven't had any approaches yet, but obviously, if we did get approaches, the committee would consider that.
Additional funds have been secured to help people move away from emergency food support in Glasgow. The Fair Food Fund has agreed to support existing projects into the next financial year, but a further £1 million will fund new activity to support children facing food poverty over the next 2 years. A woman who was found dead beside a Glasgow canal has been named. Alison MacArthur's death is being treated as unexplained after she was found at the Forth and Clyde Canal in Maryhill at 1:30 p.m. on Tuesday. She was last seen on Monday evening near Asda in the Somerston area of Glasgow. Officers are working to trace Miss McAllister's final movements. Gillian Imrie has been named the new Chief Inspector of Constabulary in Scotland. In her new role, Miss Imrie will deliver an annual programme of independent inspection, monitoring and evaluation of Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority. Miss Imrie has worked for over 30 years in Scottish policing and will succeed Derek Penman. That's the news. I'm Georgina Davis.
Russell, you're the Scottish Government Minister for all things Brexit. Where do you expect to be at the end of today?
Well, I hope that the Scottish Parliament will have passed the continuity bill, that is, the bill that creates the circumstances in which Scotland can control what happens over the next year to 2 years in the Brexit process. If we are in the position to have that, then we have a bill available should we choose not to give legislative consent to the UK bill. And that's, of course, the dispute we've been having, because we haven't given legislative consent to the UK withdrawal bill, and we can't do it in the present circumstances. So this creates the circumstances in which we could move forward, regrettably, in the Brexit process, because I don't want to leave the EU, I absolutely don't want to leave, but if that happens, then we take control of some of the important levers, not all of them, but some of the important levers in terms of what happens legislatively, so that there is no cliff edge, so that Scottish businesses and individuals in Scotland don't face impossible circumstances, whether it be in the end of March 2019 or the end of December 2020.
Hi, I'm Cameron Archibald. The EU Continuity Bill aims to bring EU legislation into the hands of Holyrood without getting into Westminster first. The Scottish Government have decided that the UK Government is using Brexit to take control of powers which currently rely on the EU, but should be devolved to Holyrood. The Scottish Government has received backing from the Greens, Liberal Democrats and Labour, with the Conservatives being the only party opposing the bill. Adam Tompkins, Constitution spokesman for the Conservatives, has labelled the bill illegal constitutional legislation, with his party tabling over 140 amendments to the bill. Tonight I'm joined by Anthony Salamone, Research Fellow at the Scottish Centre on European Relations and Managing Editor of European Futures. Hi Anthony, how you doing?
Good, Cameron.
So I'm doing fine, thanks. Let's discuss the EU Continuity Bill first. So in your view, how would you summarise it? What is the Scottish Government aiming to achieve with it?
Well, the EU Continuity Bill is a complicated bill, though it is relatively short. Its purpose is twofold. One is to incorporate EU law into Scottish law in devolved areas after Brexit to ensure sort of EU law can continue as it has done before. It also provides powers to Scottish ministers to amend that legislation to make it work after Brexit, because certain provisions to it won't apply, won't make sense if they refer to EU institutions or the member states and so on. So it's designed to provide that short-term stability to the Scottish legal system after Brexit.
Do you think it actually offers that short-term stability after Brexit, in the sense that do you believe it's actually constitutionally okay?
I think there are two questions there. Is one, how would the bill function? Would it provide stability? I think broadly speaking, the aims of the bill would provide continuity, but it's important to remember that it only covers devolved law. So obviously in reserved matters, everything would fall under the e-withdrawal bill. So the question is, if the two bills became law, and how well would they work together, or not? And of course, keeping in mind the Scottish Government has stated its preferred outcome is to not use the EU Continuity Bill, instead to focus on having everything work well in the EU Withdrawal Bill, but they have concerns. The second question is it constitutional? Does it fall within devolved competence? And that is a matter for debate. We know that the Scottish Parliament's presiding officer, Ken McIntosh, is of the view that the bill as constructed is not within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, whereas the Scottish Government and the Lord Advocate believe that it is.
It's interesting that you bring up the different opinions, because we know Adam Tompkins said that it's, quote, illegal constitutional legislation. Illegal is quite a strong word. Would you go as far to say it's illegal?
Well, no, I think not necessarily. As I say, this is a very complicated situation. It's an unprecedented one. Mm-hmm. This is the first time that a Scottish government has introduced a bill that the presiding officer hasn't certified it's legislatively competent to do so. But as the presiding officer said himself in his analysis, that does not mean that the bill cannot progress. It does not mean that the bill cannot go through its legislative stages. The only requirement under the Scotland Act is that he or she render their opinion, and he's done so. So it's up to the Parliament itself to decide these issues. The question on legislative competence is very much hinged on the nature of the Scottish Parliament's obligation not to legislate contrary to EU law. Because, of course, the main provisions of the bill would change the way EU law works in Scotland, but would only apply after Brexit's happened. So it's very much a question of timing. Can the Scottish Parliament legislate for something that it does not have the right to do now, but is likely to have the right to do later? So in the question of whether or not that's illegal or unlawful, obviously that's something only the courts could eventually decide. Indeed, this bill may well end up find itself before the UK Supreme Court.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the Supreme Court, because we heard from the EU committee, Professor Aileen McHarg and Dr. Christopher Corkindale from Strathclyde University. They say that they do believe that it's in Parliament's competence, but they do believe that it will lead to a ruling in Supreme Court. Do you believe it will lead to there, or do you believe that there's still a chance of agreement between the Scottish Government and UK Government?
Well, on the question of can the UK government, Scottish governments, along with the Welsh government, of course, reach an agreement and have everything related to this in the EU withdrawal bill, I think that's certainly still possible. And as they say, the Scottish government's stated view is they wish for that to happen because it solves a lot of problems and makes things easier. EU law itself is complicated. Obviously, Brexit makes it even more so. And the extent to which there might be conflicting ways EU law was interpreted if it was through the EU Continuity Act, if it becomes in Scotland, in the EU Withdrawal Act at UK level, that would create a lot of difficulties, a lot of uncertainties that I think everyone would try and want to avoid. So who knows what will happen, but I do believe that there is a genuine spirit of goodwill on the part of the devolved administration, certainly, and hopefully the UK government as well.
We know from earlier today that the Welsh Parliament have passed their EU Continuity Bill, but the difference between in Scotland and Wales was that their presiding officer believed that it was in the Welsh Parliament's position to pass it, whereas obviously, as you both pointed out, Ken McIntosh believes it's not in Scotland's case. Is there a reason why those two differ in opinions? Is the Welsh Parliament, does it have a different kind of legislative system compared to Scotland? Are they very similar, or is it just a difference of opinion?
Well, I should say I don't know the Welsh politics too greatly, but what I certainly can say is that the systems of devolution which the two nations have are different. And obviously, the Scottish system is on the principle of reserved versus devolved competence, in that everything which is not reserved, not everything that's not explicitly reserved in the Scotland Act is devolved. Whereas the Welsh Parliament operates, or the Welsh National Assembly for Wales, which will eventually be renamed the Welsh Parliament, it's reversed.
Right.
Only matters which have been specifically conferred on the National Assembly for Wales do they have the right to legislate on.
Is there a reason for that, or is that just the way it's been built?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I am of the understanding that I would think Welsh politicians would prefer to move in the direction of the Scottish devolution settlement.
Right.
It's obviously you keep in mind the respective powers of the devolved nations. Scotland is a larger entity; it's a larger part of the UK, and has always been able to act more effectively with the UK government in trying to achieve what it wants, whereas Wales is a much smaller part of the UK, and obviously the history between England and Wales is very different to the history between England and Scotland. I think that has an impact.
So there is one section in the Scotland Act, specifically here, Section 28, Part 7, which says that UK, as a sovereign state, could simply just ignore both the bills from Wales and Scotland. What does that mean politically, but also technically as well?
Well, in both cases it would be complicated and certainly lead to if not a constitutional crisis, or indeed if we're already in one, to a deeper constitutional crisis. On the legal side, yes, the UK Parliament asserts that it has parliamentary sovereignty, so that it has the right to legislate however it wishes. No UK Parliament can bind a future UK Parliament, and the UK Parliament can legislate contrary to the devolved assemblies. And obviously, under the Sewell Convention, the sort of UK level had pledged not to do so in normal circumstances. And the question is Brexit normal circumstances? Not obviously without the legislative consent of the respective devolved assembly. So legally, yes, that could be, the UK could overrule or could ignore acts of the Scottish Parliament or the National Assembly for Wales. But as I say, there could be conflicts in terms of how EU law is interpreted and applied. As I say, I presume all parties would want to avoid that. Now, on the question of the political side, it would be presumably extremely unpopular, both in Wales and in Scotland, for acts of their respective parliaments to be ignored or to be overruled. And of course, the key question on the Scottish and Welsh governments not agreeing to the EU withdrawal bill as it currently stands is the question of giving legislative consent through a legislative consent motion. It's hard to, as I say, we are in very much unprecedented circumstances. It's hard to know what happens next, but we could only see that continuing disagreement leading to some sort of rupture like that to be very damaging for everyone.
So there are 111 powers which are being put for debate here. The idea that Westminster is attempting a power grab, to which around just over 20 of them are the specific ones maybe in fisheries and agriculture, which are the most heated. Would you say, in your opinion, that Westminster is attempting a power grab, or is this merely a transitional period of them holding powers?
Well, I certainly think that the way in which the UK government has gone about sort of bringing powers back from the EU and attributing them within the UK system is questionable. Now, I mean, I think there's certainly some logic to the idea that in certain areas it makes sense for the UK to have a common framework. That's been the debate. Indeed, the Scottish government and the Welsh government have agreed that there are certain areas where it makes sense for the whole of the UK to have a common approach. The question is, how do you get to that common approach? Would it be, as the Scottish and Welsh governments would suggest, and obviously not mentioning Northern Ireland here because it doesn't currently have a government, is only represented in certain situations by civil servants, which is obviously a detriment because these are the key issues which affect Northern Ireland as well. They want to try and find common frameworks, but they want it from the position of powers which were already devolved. If they have some sort of EU dimension, they should go back to the nations concerned and then gone to the central level, rather than everything should be concentrated in Westminster and then perhaps shared or not. Those are two very different approaches. I think the spirit of devolution is much more in line with the first approach, which is that sort of extensive consultation and agreement and support of the devolved administrations with whatever settlement comes out from the beginning is infinitely preferable and would be a much better outcome than the UK government simply taking powers back and redispersing them if it feels so inclined.
We noticed from this bill that the Scottish National Party, who are in government, have backing from the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, to which the only party opposing it are the Conservatives, which means what we really have is a split between both unionist parties. Politically, what does this mean if come another referendum on independence? Would we see a split campaign between Labour and Lib Dems or the Scottish Conservatives, based on the idea that Labour and the Lib Dems seemingly back devolution, but it's almost weakness of backing devolution for the Tories?
Well, I think it's very interesting how all the parties in the Parliament, particularly the pro-union parties, have approached the EU continuity bill. They say we don't know exactly what the final outcome of the vote is on the bill itself, to see whether or not the parties' positions are the same. But at the stages 1 and 2, the Liberal Democrats and Labour supported the bill, whereas the Conservatives didn't. Those are different strategies. Presumably all three of those parties would articulate their strong support for the union, but they've taken different approaches. The Labour and Lib Dem approaches on the whole have been more to amend certain parts of the bill to try to improve it, or indeed to try and have greater scrutiny. That was one thing particularly Labour was arguing, that there should be more time, that we shouldn't necessarily be using the emergency bill procedure, or if we are, we shouldn't be so quickly, whereas the Conservatives are taking a much more principled approach in opposing the bill, saying this is not right, this is contrary to the union, it's contrary to everything. But on the question of an independence referendum in the campaign, I think it's absolutely certain, regardless of the EU continuity bill, that the three unionist parties are likely to campaign separately because of the fall from grace that Labour had after the 2014 campaign to be seen to be associated with the Conservative parties. I don't think they would do that again. If you look at how the parties campaigned in the 2016 EU referendum, each political party in Scotland each had its own, in their case, all pro-Remain campaigns, but they were all distinct, and I'm sure you'd see that for a future independence referendum too.
We both saw, watching the Scottish Parliament live, the Lord Advocate do a Q&A with the entire Scottish Parliament, asking on the EU continuity bill, to which he says it's in the position to be passed without a real legal challenge. From when you saw it, what was your opinion on his Q&A? Do you feel like he answered the hard questions? Do you feel like he left some open? And if there are questions which he didn't really answer properly, how would you answer them?
Well, as I say, the main area of focus that both the presiding officer and the Lord Advocate focused on was, is this measure contrary to the obligation not to legislate that would contravene EU law? I think that is obviously a test which is necessary, but there are other questions about this bill as well, not least the fact that the Constitution and EU affairs are both reserved matters. So not only is the question of EU law or not, it's a question of does the bill fall out with devolved competence itself? Now, from the arguments that the Lord Advocate would put in response to questions, particularly from the Conservative Party on particular points of the bill, I can't remember the debate in detail, but I didn't find the Lord Advocate's answers as convincing as I thought they would be, but that might have just been the sort of atmosphere in the chamber on the day.
So where he wasn't as convincing, where would you see improvement? What if you were the Lord Advocate and you were in the Scottish Parliament, and assuming that you were to answer honestly in your own opinion on the bill, where would you answer where he failed to answer? So is there anywhere which you felt like he could have done a much better job at answering it, and what would that answer be in your view?
Well, keep in mind, I'm not a lawyer, nor am I QC, nor am I as distinguished as the Lord Advocate, but in focusing on the question of EU law, clearly the aspect is the timing, and can the Scottish Parliament legislate contrary to EU law, but defer the operational nature of those provisions until you get to a point after Brexit? I mean, one of the arguments that he raised was, well, this bill is mirrored in large part on the EU withdrawal bill, and therefore if we are acting in a way which is not in keeping with the legal system, then indeed that must be the same for the EU withdrawal bill as well, because they're comparable. Now, obviously, that's not completely true, because it's only the Scottish Parliament that has that mandate under the Scotland Act not to legislate contrary to EU law, and obviously the UK Parliament has no such restriction because it asserts parliamentary sovereignty. So I would want to try and maybe rethink on those key arguments about how to effectively argue that the absolute necessity of preparing in advance for Brexit, and that waiting until after Brexit happens, or indeed waiting until Brexit Day to prepare for ensuring that the legal system continues to function as of Brexit Day itself, necessitates to an extent that preparations be taken in advance. And indeed, if you draw from the fact that the UK government is doing so, or UK Parliament is wishing to do so as well, that it doesn't necessarily contravene the restrictions. There was as well that obligation is intrinsically tied to EU membership. And once EU membership ends, that obligation and that provision itself would not have the same meaning that it did before, because EU membership would not be there. But all of this points to the fact that these are very difficult and complicated issues. Brexit itself raises up so many challenges to politics, but also to law. If say, the EU continuity bill passes and it covers devolved areas and there's no agreement at UK level and the EU withdrawal bill only applies to reserved law, what if there are EU provisions where the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament interpret them differently? I mean, that will have serious implications for people in their everyday lives. It's hard to foresee what those many issues will be, but there are more and more that come up by the day.
You do mention that it's a complicated process, and it absolutely is. And maybe it's easy for us to talk about it because I've done research and you're in the area itself to know what you're talking about. But there are people outside of politics, when they look at this debate, they'll be cross-eyed, they'll scratch their head wondering what the heck people are talking about. How do you feel that the government could be doing more to communicate with citizens to try and get involved in the debate? Do you feel that more could be done to try and get them engaged, or do you feel that at this stage it's just too much of a mess?
No, I think trying to involve citizens in a process as complicated as Brexit makes sense. Keeping in mind that many people feel unsure about engaging with politics in general. When you get to European questions, it adds another layer of complexity because the EU is so complicated, and indeed I find the EU complicated at times. But when you look at how other countries, for instance, have approached questions such as constitutional reform, you look at Iceland, they've reformed their constitution on the basis of a citizens' assembly. There are certainly ways in which, keeping in mind the UK government is in charge of the Brexit negotiations, obviously the Scottish government tries to feed in, but the UK government is clearly leading them, could try to involve everyday people more comprehensively engaging with their views are, and I would certainly be supportive of something like that.
We've just had an update, by the way, that the EU Continuity Bill in the Scottish Parliament has passed by 95 votes to 32. So seeing as it's passed, what do you think the first reactions are going to be? Do you believe we'll see a legal challenge right away, or do you believe time will continue on and we might see nothing happen at all?
Well, if it was 95 to 32, I could presume that's the Conservative Party voting against, and
yes,
perhaps maybe some others or not. Yeah, I think a legal challenge is certainly possible, because...
do you think it will happen right away, or do you reckon that there'll maybe be a time?
Well, that's difficult to tell. I mean, since the bill has passed the Parliament, it has to wait several weeks before it receives formal royal assent from the monarch, and then officially becomes an act of the Scottish Parliament. So it's possible that one would presume that people who might be interested in mounting a legal challenge would have already been preparing for it. I would guess. I don't know. But one thing is for certain is that Ruth Davidson had clearly ruled out that the Scottish Conservative Party itself would not be one to challenge the bill. So if that's the case, then it would have to come from someone else, private citizen or concerned party, and it would take us straight back to the Supreme Court.
Let's quickly talk about a different bill, very briefly. The EU withdrawal bill in Westminster. The other day we found out that fisheries will be in the Common Fisheries Policy for an extra 2 years during transition period, which we saw a lot of Conservative MPs come out saying they will vote down a bill in such circumstances. What kind of state is the EU withdrawal bill in at the moment? Is it able to pass at this rate if things were to be assumed to be okay, or do you believe in the state it is right now, it needs to be heavily changed?
Well, there's a lot to talk about in the EU withdrawal bill. It's currently still in the House of Lords. I think there may be 1 or 2 days left of debate in the Lords on amendments to the bill. Obviously, on the provisions that relate to devolution, I suppose maybe we should focus on that because there are a lot of aspects in the bill. It's clear that the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government are not content with them. That's the whole point of the continuity bills. And indeed, the UK Government said it was wished to amend them as well. But it never put down the amendments when the legislation was in the House of Commons. Of course, that adds a layer of complexity because the SNP is not represented in the House of Lords because on principle they don't have any peers. So that means that if the Scottish Government wishes to have any amendments put to the bill in the House of Lords, they have to sort of relay them through sympathetic peers, which is a very complex situation. So one would presume that there will be some sort of compromise to happen to the bill, but it's all subject to these negotiations between the governments. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon was visited Theresa May recently to try and talk through this, and the key question is to what extent the sort of common frameworks would be sort of agreed between the administrations or consented to, or whether or not the governments would just be consulted on. And that's sort of the key word or two that's, that this whole debate is hinging on. Now, on the question of fisheries, which is in a sense slightly apart from the EU withdrawal bill itself, I think the pledges by the UK government to leave the common fisheries policy and have a relatively short transition and take control over UK waters in the immediate aftermath of Brexit Day itself was never going to work. I mean, I think the EU perspective from the beginning was through the duration of the transition period, and the EU wanted that to end in December 2020, that they would insist on the same access to UK waters for fishing as had been the case during EU membership, because that's the whole point of the transition period.
If it was never going, sorry to interrupt you, but if it was never going to work, the pledges made by the Conservative Party saying that by May 2019, when we leave, or March, I can't remember off my head, when we leave, March, it's the right first time, in March 2019 when we leave, we will not be in the CFP policy. Why did he say that then in the first place? Was that just to kind of raise spirits? Or did he genuinely think that they could, by next year, not be within the CFP?
Well, I don't know what their strategy was, what they were thinking, but I do know that the EU, as with much of the Brexit negotiations, has had very clear positions from the beginning. And the EU line was always this, that if you want to have a transition period, we are sympathetic to that. But it must be a standstill status quo transition, in which the UK is, for all intents and purposes, part of the structures of the European Union, but you have no say and no voice and no vote. And so the UK's formal participation in the common fisheries policy should end when Brexit happens, but the question is sort of the residual access to UK waters for EU fishermen. And so the suggestion was that there should be a shorter period from the UK side, but instead it will be the full length of the transition. So no, I can't see that as being a surprise. And of course, keep in mind that the UK government, having triggered Article 50 back when it did, is in a very relatively weak position in negotiations. If you look back on many of the areas where the UK government said, we want this position and we'll fight for it, they usually ended up agreeing with what the EU had always suggested. Even when you go far back to the sequencing of the talks, the timetable, when the EU said we want to talk about withdrawal, and then we'll talk about transition, and then we'll talk about the future relationship, and David Davis said it would be the row of the summer, and they would contest this, and when they got in their first meeting, they agreed it within the first minute of the meeting. So you look at across all of those issues, from that to citizens' rights, to the sort of role of the European Court of Justice and citizens' rights, and so on, across all of those areas, and indeed to the financial contribution. I mean, the UK government initially even refused to acknowledge that the UK had any financial obligation to the European Union as a real consequence of EU membership, and instead has signed up to, in large measure, the EU's methodology for calculating what the UK's residual financial commitments are to the UK, from having been a member for the time 45 going on 46 years. So you look across the piece as how the Brexit negotiations have gone so far. The UK government has had to agree to most of what the EU had suggested anyway, so on the fisheries, why would that be any surprise if that was the case there too?
It's not just the UK government that have an issue with the common fisheries policy. We also know that the Scottish government have their issues with it, and they want to, in their scenario, have an independent Scotland within the EU, but they want to negotiate a reformed or completely scrap the CFP for an independent Scotland. Now, obviously, this is much debated, but in the assumption that Scotland votes yes, and we're having a reasonable transition period into the EU, what are the actual chances of the Scottish government scrapping CFP or even reforming it while negotiating with the EU if the UK government having such a hard time right now?
I think there are two issues. One is that on the immediate question of the fisheries and the Brexit negotiations and so on, yes, it is a very peculiar position to see the SNP in, because it is a party which is pro-EU and supports EU membership for an independent Scotland. But I mean, the reaction from the SNP to this was to strongly criticise the Conservatives and say, we would have done better in negotiating a deal, which I suppose makes sense in the respect of the fact that after the sort of 2019, so for the 2020 negotiations, the UK will be consulted and won't actually be at the table. And so on that respect, yes, the UK did give away something, so it would actually be different than EU membership. On the question of an independent Scotland and the ability to try and achieve a reform of the common fisheries policy, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the EU very much works on the basis of networks and collaboration and relationships. In order to get anything done in Brussels, you usually need to have a spirit of cooperation and partnership and be willing to work with the member states and develop close relationships with them over months and years. So I think it's relatively unlikely that a new country joining the EU, now keeping in mind that Scotland was part of the EU as through the UK and so on, but as a new member state, I think it would be difficult to see how Scotland could achieve a radical reform of an EU policy as the newest member of the club. That being said, there are many voices saying that the common fisheries policy is outdated and needs to change, and those are coming from other member states as well. But equally, it's worth noting that the Scottish territorial waters are large, and whatever arrangements where reforms come up, access to those waters is something which is valuable to other member states. So I'm sure a reform is possible, but I think the question is the timescale and also the extent of which any reform would be. But the overarching principle is the only way to change EU policy is to be at the table.
So you talk about how radical reform for a new independent Scotland would be really hard. To what extent then do you think that an independent Scotland and the Scottish Government could influence such a policy area? Would it be little? Would it take maybe 10 years? Would it be maybe shorter, 5 years? How would you see it? I know it's hypothetical, but in a scenario where people are reasonable enough and they judge an independent Scotland and its background within the UK and also being the EU, how would you see it come out?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say. It also depends in large part on how the accession negotiations would go, what else Scotland would be looking for in those negotiations, and how successful it was in achieving what it was looking for. So, for instance, I mean, it's difficult to see how Scotland would get many of the UK's opt-outs, except for on Schengen, if Scotland wanted to be in a common travel area with the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the UK. I think the EU would probably recognise that and understand that, but otherwise, Scotland may be pushing on other issues, for instance, trying to have some sort of opt-out of the euro. And as I say, Brussels operates very much on a sort of, a give and take approach. So if Scotland has secured, for instance, favourable accession terms that it's really happy with, and includes something on the euro that's really happy with, the expectation is that Scotland wouldn't immediately push to change something else as well.
Right.
It might have to wait some time to do that.
So it's all about attitude then, especially. So if an independent Scotland, in the assumption it's independent, is into the EU, if it gets a good deal, they won't make a big fuss until maybe later down the line. Is that, in summary, what you're kind of saying?
Well, certainly. It's just that if the best way to approach the EU is to understand how it works. And I think one of the difficulties that we've seen with UK governments over the years, that despite the fact that the UK has been a member state for over 4 decades, despite the fact that the UK diplomatic service is professional and competent, that the UK approach has often been much more confrontational and blustery, and that's not the way to get things done in the EU. So, if Scotland were to take a much more cooperative approach and to embrace what the EU stands for and to articulate that clearly, then I'm sure that the reception from the other member states would be much more positive than has been the UK approach to achieving things. That means that the scope for achieving more within the EU, I think, would be greater.
Great. Anthony Salamoni, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And that is all we have time for just now. If you do enjoy our pilot show, please give us support. You can subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland and purely as someone to get updates, or you can even give a donation, which is all the more helpful. All the more donations means that we can produce great interviews with people like Anthony himself and all more experts and politicians. But that's all from me. I'm Cameron Archibald, and you've been watching Broadcasting Scotland. Good night.